Welcome to Hort Culture, where a group of extension professionals and plant people talk about the business, production, and joy of planting seeds and helping them grow. Join us as we explore the culture of horticulture. Well, it is a rainy recording day here in the Bluegrass for probably the whole state at this point. It feels like it's not stopped raining in a while. So good thing we put out all those great episodes about what to do when you get too much water. So head of the game. That was fortuitous.
Yes. That worked out really good for us, I suppose.
It's like we've lived here in the spring before.
Yes. When it's dry, it's dry. But when it's wet, it's really wet.
Yeah.
And that's where we are now. Yeah.
It's a very peaceful rain again today. So that's at least good. It's not flooding like
as opposed
crazy.
To like a rain with a vendetta.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like violent.
Yeah, aggressive
war
rain.
in its heart. Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
There's like actually water seeping into the soil profile.
Oh, you're talking about sideways rain, and it's angry. Yes.
Yeah, that's an angry rain. I like polite rains.
Okay. That distinction, like when I was out in New Mexico, there's like this, like the Navajo have like a feminine rain, and that's this chill rain because it like rejuvenates, mm-hmm. And then there's like the masculine rain, and it's like violent and blows stuff around. And it's not as good.
Washes things away, tears stuff up. Yeah.
The Navajo get it.
I'm not so sure I'm comfortable with signing that gender roles because as a man, I mean, maybe it's true. I don't know.
Nurture, but I guess it's just, this is the rain, you know, it's what it is.
They have to have things, ways to refer to things quickly because if they say it's a manly rain, run for your lives. I mean, that says a lot in a few amount of words. So that's a way to sum it up, maybe.
That's true. Like if you said that to just about anybody, I feel like they would know what you're talking about immediately.
I don't know. If somebody said lady rain, I might be confused. No. It's a lady rain. I mean, I don't know what that is.
Let's not call it lady, but if you said this is a feminine rain, I feel like the word, that word
I think
is
that
different.
That's just an Elizabethan lady rain. I mean, that's just a more proper way.
I'm so sorry. I forgot you were around then.
It feels like a feminine rain is coming on.
If someone said it was the Queen Anne's pocket melon.
Okay. Mm-hmm. That's better, Brett. I'm glad you're bringing this full circle back around to sensibility.
Good callback.
The plum granny of rains, if you will.
Now, if there's listeners out there that don't get the reference, that's your fault. You have to go back and listen to the prior episode.
Cucurbits, baby.
Yes, we talked a lot about such topics as cucurbits,
pocket melons, plum granny, if you will.
Pocket
melons and feminine rain. We have a show title, and it happened in the first 5 minutes. Yeah.
Well,
we need to give Elvis. That old Kentucky rain.
Oh my God.
Yes. The microphone is picking all of that up, and it's gold.
I'm loving it, right? Record. But we are talking about something else besides rain and pocket melons today. It is compost, which we were all, I think, a little surprised when we were coming up, or at least I was. It felt the vibe like everybody was, but we hadn't talked about compost yet. And like all of these, we referred to it a lot. And I was like, are you sure we haven't talked about it? And we went back through the list and we were like, we have not had an episode on compost yet. And so it felt like about dang time. It was time as we start the season.
We get lots of questions on compost. Lots and lots of questions.
What to do, what to put in it, all that jazz.
And
those kind of like basic questions are the common ones you get, like, should I, how do I do it? That kind of thing.
I think starting out with how do I start like a bin is usually the first question we get. And there are tons of options. And it's kind of comes down to like functionality. If you like have this Venn diagram of like, there's the really, really functional, but then there's like the really, really aesthetically pleasing. And most of the time, most people want to find something right in the middle. And there are some things that are, but it definitely depends on your scale. I think that's usually how I ask people. It's like, well, what is your scale? Yeah. What do you want to use this for? Is it like your pots, your small backyard garden, your raised beds? Or is this a larger scale? You're putting this in a high tunnel commercial.
I have 10 acres for my composting area for my 600 acre plant production system.
Do you think a 90 horsepower tractor will be big enough to turn my compost pile?
How many tractors do I need for the turning events?
Yeah. How many people do you have that can actually turn this? Because that's part of it. But so let's start with the like high functionality side of it and just sort of like go through that spectrum like relatively quickly of like highest functionality, but maybe least aesthetically pleasing, at least, to my
like
brain.
what you need it to do
I
at a
feel like
bare
you're
Right.
minimum.
talking about my trash heap out back, Alexis. You're gently,
It's not a trash heap if you're not putting
it's a
trash
cold compost pile. That's what I've learned to call it,
Yeah, there
and
you
that's
go.
okay for you home
That's the
composters
lingo.
that know that. Yes,
Cold
so
compost.
Maybe that's an important place to start, right? Is that a
Yes.
poorly
Yeah, yeah.
managed pile is one that is just going to work really slow and it won't be
Yeah.
generating compost for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
So it's
that's
not
what
like
we're
you can really
doing.
go
Yeah,
wrong. You can just like go off
Or go
or
stinky.
that's
Yeah,
yeah,
that.
it
Somebody
smelly,
put it.
stinks and it
fuzzy.
doesn't do
Yeah,
anything. There's your
and it
bad
has raccoons
compost.
coming out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, rats.
Rats and raccoons. And somebody put it a great way. They were like, they were in the office one day and they said for them, they were like, well, I guess it all just, I was rattling off all of these things and temperatures and microorganisms and all the things that we cover when we're talking to someone about composting. And they were going to involve themselves in a little bit larger operation, kind of like, they wanted to produce a volume of
Mhm.
compost. And they stopped me. They were like, so you're just saying that it's all relative to the speed with which we want to finish. And I thought for a second, I was like, yeah, I guess that's true.
Mhm.
And I guess you start there because in nature, if you walk in the woods, you're seeing composting everywhere with micro and
Mhm.
macro, organisms like termites all the way down to, fungi. It's
Mhm.
happening all the time, but it's happening on a little bit slower
Mhm.
scale, usually a little
Yeah.
bit slower time scale, usually.
And I
So yeah.
think one important thing to talk about that I think we're referencing mostly today is aerobic composting versus
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
anaerobic composting, which we have a little mini episode we'll throw out
Mm-hmm.
soon about like an
Yes.
anaerobic version of that. But primarily, what most people are going to do, the traditional compost, when that comes to mind, is going to be aerobic, which means there's air involved. So when we talk about turning, you're adding air into that system, and that tends to be a little bit of a slower process. So, like, how slow are we talking? Who? How fast have you ever made good compost?
Oh goodness. In a large commercial operation, I worked with a city before, and they had the big piles 7, 8 feet tall that were being actively managed, and it was incredible to me. It was way north of 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and the
Mhm.
way we would test the piles and how long they were going to last, you just put that rod in there about
Mm-hmm.
5 to 6 feet deep, and you pulled that out, and basically, I learned not to touch it. I would just spit on it, and it would sizzle. I'm like, "Yep, that's going to be done in 3 weeks." Because you would leave it in there and you would time for a certain amount of time on your watch and you would pull the thing out, it would almost glow. It would get hot. Now that compost was finishing, goodness, I don't know, it was finishing in 4 weeks, but they were
So
Mhm.
blending
Yeah, that's
specific amounts of
highly,
fast.
new and
right,
old.
right,
Yeah.
Yeah,
right. So that's
fast.
highly managed.
Yes, and
What's
Yeah.
going in it,
specific
when
conditions.
turned,
Yes.
right,
Hmm.
right, moisture
Yeah.
content, that kind of
And they were
stuff.
turning that and getting complete aeration even down through the 7, 8 foot column. So they were very
Mm-hmm.
actively
Yeah.
managing that on a concrete pad. So that's on the
Yeah,
truly
that's the
quick
upper
end.
end. I was gonna say
That's the super fast end.
because there I worked with a guy that was creating a lot of volume of compost and was managing it quickly, but wasn't that fast. He's like 45-day kind of turnaround.
Mm-hmm.
But
And
Which
that's
is
still
still
really
really
fast.
quick.
yeah,
Yeah.
45 days is really fast. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty darn quick. And I think this operation I was working with, which we'll get into details on this, is another huge aspect of home composting is the particle size.
Mm-hmm.
And this
Mhm.
particular operation I was working with was actually
Like
shredding
chipping it.
everything to a uniform size. Like if you can imagine a wood chip that comes out of like the chippers that you see on the side of the road, that is
Mhm.
absolutely huge compared to this was smaller than sawdust particles. What was going into
Wow.
this operation,
Yeah.
and so their
More
biggest
surface
thing they were dealing
area.
with is
Yeah.
compression. They didn't want it to compress, so they had to constantly turn it. But 45
Mm-hmm.
days still is super fast to
Yeah.
produce compost. And yeah, it's just
That
that's quick.
particle size is how I gotta imagine they were pulling that off because all
Yeah.
that
Yes,
surface
that's how they were
area.
doing it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's incredible. That's awesome though.
yeah,
So
but
so first tip of the podcast, if you want compost faster, put in smaller particle sizes. So
yeah.
whatever you're putting in, and we'll talk about what to and not, like what to put in and what not, but start with smaller particle sizes. So like if you're putting the banana peel in, chop it up or something like that, and it does make a difference in how
Mhm.
quickly that compost will finish. So that's our first little tip here.
Yeah, somebody put it to me. They were like, and it was a college class, and we were doing microbiology, and the professor was like, "Well, if you really think about it, that's like trying to feed like a city bus to you and saying have at it." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." When we were talking relative particle
Love a
sizes,
challenge.
yeah, I'm like, "Okay,
Is it made
is it
of
made out of
cheese
chocolate?"
or
Yes,
Can
yeah,
I put gravy on it?
can I
yes,
eat it like a
makes it
string
slide. But
cheese?
yeah, that's a very practical question. So particle size, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a
Particle
big
size
deal.
and oxygen or air, I think, are probably like your
Yeah,
often most limiting factors in
yeah.
this.
But I guess even before we've kind of skipped over, and Alexa started talking about it. One of the probably the most important thing if someone's completely new to composting is what can go in there.
Yeah.
Should we talk about that? I mean, all the things that can, and maybe some of the things that shouldn't go in a compost
I
pile.
feel like it's easier for me, maybe it's because I'm negative, to talk about what can't go in there because I feel like
Okay.
the list is a lot shorter
Yeah.
than the what can go in there. So I'll start us off and then we can just roundtable what can't go in there. So for aerobic composts, and if you let's call it specifically home compost, not a commercial composting system.
Amateur
Amateur,
composting.
more amateur level. Even a lot of our farmers are what we would consider amateur because it's not their full-time job to
Yeah,
run a
sure.
compost. So I'm gonna say no meat products.
Mm.
So don't throw your leftover chicken bones in there. Don't throw your steak bones. So I'm gonna start off with no meat products because you will get rats.
Yeah. You will get higher level organisms that you don't want, like a raccoon, for instance, or rats or whatnot. Yes.
Yeah,
Great
there
point,
are like
Alexis.
you can compost bodies. I mean,
Yeah.
let's just call it
Indeed.
what it. There are dead animal removal
Yeah. Whole
composting.
animal composting.
Right.
Yeah, it's
You
amazing.
don't
That's
want
an
to do that
amazing.
in your backyard.
No.
But it's a very different system. It's a lot. Yeah, you're not
Yeah,
going
Very
to do
well,
if you're
that. But
very much
listening to a Hort Culture podcast episode, you shouldn't be coming here to figure out how to do whole animal composting.
no.
but
You might
you
want to read a
can.
book or two or talk to someone maybe
I
Some
who's
have
in the
threatened people
microbiologists.
biz.
before, and I was just like, you know what? I know how to compost a body, so you can use that as a threat.
Mhm.
There you go.
So
Or just
next,
a heads up.
what
So,
else?
I don't typically put like lawn trimmings in unless I
Mhm.
know where they come from, just because the persistence of certain chemicals and the potential of those lawn chemicals being on grass trimmings. First of all, I mean, most of the time we recommend leaving grass trimmings on the lawn, but there's certain scenarios where it may be advantageous to remove those grass trimmings and compost those. But the first question you ask as a homeowner is there any kind of chemical on there? Then you have to do a
Mhm.
little bit of a deep dive there, finding out the nature of chemicals. If in
Mhm.
doubt, just don't put chemically treated plant materials
Mhm.
Mm.
into a compost pile.
Right.
Yeah.
And I hesitate with weed trimmings too because, or grass trimmings too, because sometimes you can be putting, Bermuda grass or things that spread by rhizomes. You can also, if maybe you let the grass get a little too high because it won't stop raining, you can have weed seed, like seed heads that have formed in there. Like annual bluegrass is a really good example. It flowers and goes to seed on like really short. So even if your grass isn't 6 foot tall, you can't have
Mm-hmm.
weed seed. So I always hesitate to use lawn clippings as a mulch or as a in my compost. But that's me being very cautious. So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on the cautious side, I generally don't put in anything that is pretty disease resistant. I don't put the cleaned up plants in there at the
mm-hmm,
end of the season. So like tomato plants or cucurbits, I tend to
mm-hmm,
put those in my home compost. I put those into the yard waste
mm-hmm,
bin because I there's no way that I can reliably hold the temperature high enough to definitely kill the stuff that could be a problem. And so I
Mm-hmm.
tend to not put anything that either has disease or that it tends to be disease prone if I was gonna, be planting that out
Especially if
again.
you're newer, I guess, Brett, right? Because,
Totally.
later on we'll talk about temperatures and, the duration of the temperature and the degree of the temperature. But it takes a pretty high temperature to kill some of these weed seeds and especially diseases. So if
Mhm.
you're a new composter and you do not have confidence in your ability to get what we call a hot compost pile for a period of time, then yeah, those things are kind of off the table, especially then.
Yeah, I would say new, or like, and this is just something I want to throw out there because just like we've talked about how some people love lawns and some people hate them. Some people love to compost. It's like a whole thing. They get really into it. For me, it is literally just a trying to keep some of the vegetable scraps that we use out of the landfill and into
Same.
some sort of a rotatable thing. But I am so far from wanting to be like a huge compost guy as far as like, yeah, it's time to turn, let's rock and roll, let's turn this into something else. And so while I understand the principles and I am initiated enough to know what I'm doing, I am personally as a composter not motivated enough to turn it and make things happen frequently enough to kill those diseases. Now, if I over the course of a year, the level of the compost bin kind of goes down, and I'm adding stuff back to it, and at the end the bottom looks pretty good, and I'm able to get some compost out, that's awesome. That's sort of my, you talked about timelines. I was like, I am sure I could get it fast, but for me, it's, you know, a couple, maybe once a year, I'll pull some out, and which is totally fits with our lifestyle. And so it's not all about speed in some cases, and but maybe if you're looking to do that, then
it's
you certainly
amazing.
can speed it up.
You said keeping that out of the waste stream. I read somewhere, and I think it was one of our specialists, 2015, 2016, had a really cool composting presentation, but I think it was something like 4 pounds on average for an American organic waste per day, which roughly equates in landfills to 21% of total volume of landfills are compostable materials. That was pretty shocking to me. I don't know why I had never thought about it. But when I looked at that 21% in landfills, that was pretty amazing. And to keep that out of the waste stream, yeah, it's awesome.
And for me, at this point in my life, if I was just composting to have compost, that is not worth my time personally. But I'm composting for the same reason that, you know, you might ride your bike to work, or you might
recycle
small decisions,
or you might, you know, do those types of things. It's just a little thing. And to be honest, if I'm being totally honest and giving credit where it's due, my wife's the one that keeps us on the straight and narrow of doing the compost and taking stuff out. And I have to go turn it and do all the nasty stuff. But as far as the day to day keeping us going with it, she's the responsible party. But it just shout out to people who maybe are composting for, it's not, they don't really care about the output. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you guys are all sellouts if you're trying to use the compost. For me,
transactional with your compost.
Stupid thing that I do while I get bit by mosquitoes. You know,
you went a little Gandalf there, Brad. I loved it. You find that it's the small things, the day-to-day niceties that makes the difference.
That's right.
Yeah, I like it. How about wood ashes? Get lots of questions on that. As far as in compost bin, isn't that, to me, that's kind of like the grass clippings, not knowing the origin of the grass clippings and what may or may not have been on there. I guess I have the same question with ashes and compost bin, because, you know, there's lots of different types of wood people can burn, and it's not all natural, right?
Right.
And we don't know if
treated. You don't know what's going on with it.
They don't know if they've burned a pile of railroad ties or whatever. Yeah.
And in a best case scenario, it's like you don't want very much of it at all. Like, let's say the provenance of the wood, like it would only be a tiny amount, so it's not something you want to get into doing a lot.
Exactly.
Really alter the pH, which if you're applying that to a smaller garden, especially, that can mess up a lot of stuff when you add too much wood.
Yeah, so be very cautious, or don't do it at all with wood ash. For if you have a quantity of that, be careful of that. And I also get questions on kitty litter and pet waste. How about that?
Oh, that would be a hard no.
Yeah.
I would say pet feces or human feces. No dice. I mean,
don't tell me how to live my life, Josh.
Hey, listen.
You took the one last thing that Brett enjoyed about the compost.
It's like a David Letterman joke about The small pleasures in life ruined by a meddling bureaucracy.
Brett doesn't have a compost pile. He has a compost hole in the back, and you just ruined it. You just
My
ruined it.
special place.
Yes, his quiet place. Exactly. So, yeah, kitty litter. I don't know why I get that. It seems like we get that a couple times a year, and
What
it
about
falls into
eggshells?
that category. Yeah, no litter. No
Eggshells?
Eggshells are good.
Eggshells,
Is it
I would
eggshell?
say my word of wisdom there is that if you are cold composting, which is what I do, which is what Ray and Brett kind of talked about, where it's like a once a year, maybe once every 6 months type of thing, you're not paying a ton of attention to it. You will still have eggshells left in there if you just kind of throw the whole egg, or even just like something you slightly crushed up. So if you really want to be able to use that compost within a year, I would recommend really like breaking them down into very small
Yeah.
pieces. Otherwise, they probably won't break. And that doesn't mean you still can't put it on your garden, but it's not as satisfying when you
And they
see
look
bits
like a
of
trash
eggshell.
pile. If you get a
Yeah.
bunch
Right.
of large eggshell, people's like, why do you have a trash heap in your backyard? All of a sudden, they're judging because you have a vibrant white color out
Yeah.
there with jagged edges.
Yeah.
I'm like,
It's
great.
not as
Yeah.
satisfying when you see this like dark compost, and like, yeah, it took
Yes.
you a year to get there, maybe more, but then you have these
Mhm.
pieces of white eggshell in it, and you're like,
Or in Alexis's compost pile, a human femur, sticking out that's bleached white,
I know what I'm doing,
whatever.
Ray. You will never find it.
Yes. That's what the acid bath is for in the basement. Yes. That's what that is
Me and the
for.
fungi have an arrangement,
Yeah.
okay?
Putting the
So,
fun in fun guy.
so as far as the things that do go in there, do we want to maybe just quickly cover
Yeah.
that basic
Yeah.
brown and green
Oh yeah,
Yes.
stuff,
carbon
and
to
then
nitrogen.
before we move on to some of the what Alexis was talking about with like the form to function spectrum?
Mhm.
Sure.
Yeah. So I like to like start out. So we talk about browns and greens in compost, and to like put a sciencey name to that. Our browns are our carbon source typically, and our greens are our nitrogen source. And we call them browns and greens because a lot of the times the things that are brown are carbon sources, cardboard, or something
Wood
along those
chips.
lines, wood
Wood
chips.
chips, yeah.
Yeah, and your greens are going to be the things that would. I like to think about it as like the things that would rot quickly, right? And those are your higher nitrogen sources, and you need to have a balance of those so that you don't get smelly compost and you get your compost working. Because if you don't have enough nitrogen, enough greens, your compost will just sit there. So even after a year, it
Mhm.
might not do anything. So if you've had a problem with that in the past, you need to be adding more of those greens. If you've had smelly compost before, or anything slimy, weird, just overall weirdness happening there, you don't have enough carbon essentially soaking up those juices, but as another food source for those microbes as they break down that nitrogen. So you gotta have, and that's what Ray, we said earlier, 30 to 1 is like the
Yeah.
magic number. So 30,
Mhm.
30
Which,
carbons
yeah.
to
It's
one.
to one nitrogen. And,
Yeah.
the funny thing is, and this is a kind of a key point for home composting to me, people sometimes get hung up.
Yeah.
Absolutely hung up because, you look online and then one of the first things you're going to see is the magic 30 to 1. And that's actually a pretty hard concept in home composting because, and we kind of were joking about it before we started recording, is we were like, is that by volume or weight? And that's an excellent question from a functional standpoint. But you don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole there. You just want to keep in mind that you don't want your compost pile to compress. You have to have some brown stuff, I call it. That's low moisture, high lignin or high fiber type material. The
Mhm.
browns, like wood chips, like Josh mentioned. You
Mhm.
want some of those for a bulking agent. Usually, from a functional standpoint, I always say 2 to 1 for the green stuff. You can even go a little bit higher than that depending on particle size, but you want your pile to be bulky. So lots of browns, and scattered completely throughout that is your nitrogen, and that's your less porous, higher moisture content items. Think carrots or celery, kitchen waste type stuff, even
Mhm.
lawn clippings. That's high nitrogen, low carbon. But
Leafy
you want a
things.
mixture of the greens and browns together, usually more browns to the tune of, I don't know, if you're just looking at a pile and mixing things, at least
Mhm.
2 to 1 brown to green.
Mhm.
Otherwise, as Alexis said, you get some
Smell.
problems. Yeah, some smells. If your pile ever compresses and goes without oxygen, you will not forget the smell of hydrogen sulfide gas, which is the oxygen free process or
Mhm.
anaerobic process. Yeah, you
Yeah, I
won't
do think
forget that.
there is that, like, just sort of like a functional learning. We can use the scientific, terms and the general
Guidelines. It's a great
Yeah.
guideline.
concepts, guidelines to start, but there will be some learning curve
Yes. And that's
involved.
okay. Yeah.
And part of it is that, talking about the ratios, the green stuff, the nitrogen stuff, the food waste, etc., has a lot more water in it usually than brown stuff. And so by volume, it looks like, whoa, that's a lot of green, but that stuff dries out and will kind of compress down, and the water will become one with the compost and leave the, evaporate and all that kind of fun stuff. And so that was something I had to learn. But generally speaking, like what Alexis said and what you were saying, Ray, if your compost is bug ridden and smelly, you're not using quite enough brown.
Yeah.
And if it looks like it's just kind of sitting there, then you're probably not using quite enough green. And that it's just this ongoing kind of give and take.
You have to pay a
over
little bit of
time.
attention. Like when you go to add something to it, look at it. Like use just visual things. You don't have to know a ton about compost to be like, this is looking a little funky, or this doesn't look like anything has happened at all. And just kind of use those obvious signs to dictate what you put in there.
And I live in a neighborhood with neighbors. And so I tend to err. If I'm going to err, I'm going to err on the side of a little too much brown, because I don't want smelliness. I don't want grossness, but that does cost me in terms of speed of processing and everything else, like we're saying that. But I don't mind it as much. Again, I'm not encouraging you to do err one way or the other. We want to go right down the middle and make that perfect compost as quickly as we can.
Yeah.
But that's been my approach. Because when I started out, I didn't have enough brown material. Things got smelly and weird.
Yeah.
Neighbors complained.
Kitchen scrap stuff.
At that time, it wasn't my house. I was a rental place, so I just
snuck over to the neighbors and built a stinky pile on
left all my
property.
stuff and ran away.
Yeah.
But
people that
now
compost a lot of kitchen scraps, they say that they say they have trouble with that because they have a lot of wet stuff coming from the kitchen, and it's those composters. But on the other end of that, there's the composters that have like a huge oak tree. So they're putting, which are notoriously slow to compost sometimes, oak leaves into a compost pile, and they have no nitrogen source. And that's the people I'm like, well, put some, I mean, if you have any on hand, just lawn fertilizer, throw some of that on there, and it provides a very concentrated nitrogen source to kickstart a carbon pile. That's a trick you can use. But yeah, I'm trying to think. Usually I run into folks, they'll have a lot of one or the other, and they have to be aware of that. So yeah.
Yeah, when I was helping my parents get set up with theirs, they are mostly they're in a very high urban context, and so they tend to just have more green stuff to put into the pile. It's like a table scrap kind of situation.
Yeah.
And so I just always, I instilled in them the value of having like a nice square bale of straw around, and so that way when they were adding things in, they could just keep a layer going.
Yeah. I'm gonna say this for I told my best friend this, who also lives in urban Florida and was very excited about their tumbler compost, and she's having trouble with the browns, right? Keeping enough browns. And I said, well, I know you get a lot of Amazon boxes, so there you go. And that was a mind blown moment when I was like, shred it up, take your tape off, any staples, like you don't want anything sticky on there, but
no glossy,
no sticky,
no wax cardboard,
waxed cardboard. But a lot of the Amazon boxes I get are perfectly fine to go in the compost. But the key is just kind of shredding those particle and making those particle sizes smaller. And she was like, you have solved 2 problems for me. All of my Amazon boxes and my compost bin. So it's a win-win if you're an avid Amazon shopper, just saying.
Yeah, we're all in the e-commerce lifestyle now. It's just
that's
box after box. What else?
Newspaper.
How else am I supposed to?
I wonder. That's
I'm not doing composting for fun. So what am I supposed to do? I got to buy stuff for fun.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a shredder out there for boxes. I mean, us having this conversation makes me wonder: is there a gizmo that like chops up large quantity of boxes that they can be? Rage. Okay. Yeah. Anger, angst.
Shredding.
I like it. Well, we've talked about all the materials.
Kind of a Vitamix that's
Alexis,
like
just turn her loose. Yeah,
she will to you.
She will chew it and spit it out and start the compost pile.
All right, so we've talked about what not to put in it, sort of how to balance those things that
We
do
need to
go
build
in
the
it.
pile. We
Well,
need
we
to
need to
build it.
build the pile. Yeah.
We need to build the container and the pile now. How are we going to do that? I mean, just getting started, you got a big pile of browns and a big pile of greens. Now what?
Well, I would start with, the very simple ones, which are what they practice at really large scale, so they can't really build a structure for this thing. The windrow is really functional, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
add to one side, you take off from the other, but you have to have the space to kind of build this thing out and
Mm-hmm.
let it grow and subtract from it, and it's going to move around as you do that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's relatively simple because if you have just a pile, then how do you know like where are you taking from it and where are you
Mm-hmm.
adding and that kind of a thing.
And that's a common thing I see. People have that question. They're like, "How? When do we end this thing?" They haven't, they may not have thought about it as a process, but they've gotten a single pile, but they want to harvest the entire pile at one time, and they're like, "But
Hmm.
we keep adding new stuff," and that's a common scenario. They're like, "But what do we do with our stuff to let the one stuff, get
Decompose and
finished?" And
get
I'm like,
ready.
"Well,
Yeah.
that's kind of where the multi-bay, the classic 3-bay
Hmm.
compost. We talked a little bit about that. If you guys could talk about that, why 3 bays? Well, that's one of the reasons to me.
Yeah.
But
It's kind of like the windrow that doesn't move, right? This is
yeah,
if you
exactly.
if you
Yeah.
need some infrastructure or you have the space for some infrastructure, you're creating 3 bays. And the size of them are going to be kind of scale dependent, but for like home size, I mean, they've got some measurements in this great publication, HO75 for home composting. Talks about like 4 to 5 feet deep, 3 to 5 feet tall. Personally, the ones that I've helped set up on like a kind of a shoestring budget, the size for the depth of the bays was the same. The depth and the width was the same as loading pallets.
Yeah.
We just
Pallets
use
are a big
loading
one.
pallets around the side.
And
Mm-hmm.
And
that's
so
also good because those are open on one side, aren't they, Josh? You're
yeah.
talking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. They're open at the top and they're open at the front, but then you have 3 sides essentially, and then 3 bays side by side. So
Bays
it's like,
or stalls are another way to like if people
yeah.
are having trouble thinking of them as a bay, you can think of them as like these three sort of stalls that are all connected.
Mhm.
And but they have a little divider between them, which might be a pallet or it might be cinder blocks, or I mean it can be anything. Just kind of separate these bays or these stalls. And you start with the first one and you put all your crap in it first. And then what do you do?
Well, you layer, right? Like you layer. Well, that's how I would do it. Is kind of layering like browns and greens and keeping it
Mm-hmm.
loose so there's lots of airflow. That's the other thing about these bays is you want them to hold the pile in place, but they don't block airflow, right?
Right.
So it should be
Mm-hmm.
open. That's why pallets are kind of nice, but also people make them out of, oh, I can't remember the name for it, but like we called it like rat wire, like
Mm-hmm.
something
Yeah,
more
like
Chicken
chicken
sturdier.
wire,
wire.
Yeah,
Chicken
like chicken wire,
wire.
but kind of thicker.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
gotcha. Yeah.
hardware cloth.
Yeah,
Yep.
hardware cloth.
Yeah,
That's the
hardware
good
cloth.
technical name. Rat
And
wire.
Rat
Yeah.
also,
wire.
I like the sizes we're talking about because remember these have to be functional. And if you're turning
Mm-hmm.
them by hand, I've seen there are some compost piles out there where they've totally enclosed it on all the sides and left the top open,
Hmm.
and they've gotten them too tall and they could not reach in and turn that, which I don't think it's a good
Mm-hmm.
idea to enclose it on 4 sides. Anyways, it makes it just tougher to aerate that with like a flat fork or an English fork. That's what
Hmm.
I use kind of aerate piles with, and I recommend that for homeowners. Is that if you're actively managing that, don't make it any taller than your armpits, or preferably lower,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
because number one, just sheer volume of the pile gets unmanageable, but also you literally can't work it. It's kind of like almost like a square foot garden. If you make it too wide, you can't reach the center. The same
Mm-hmm.
is true for a compost bin. The
And if
same principles apply.
you can use the same bin system if you want to go a little bit larger. So say you're doing market gardens or your very small commercial scale, you can use like if you've got a bucket on your tractor, right? So make it wide enough for your bucket to get in there and turn it.
Hmm.
So really think about how you're going to turn it. I think is the most
Mm-hmm.
important thing when you think about what kind of compost bin should you build or buy, is like how are you going to actually manage it
Yeah.
The
versus
easier that you can make it to do that,
Mhm.
the more successful you will be in
Yeah.
composting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that is one of the recommendations, right? For if it's too stinky, is like you turn it or flip it. Which maybe we should talk about that, like when we say what
Hmm.
turning the pile means,
Hmm.
because it doesn't mean turning it clockwise or something like
Rotating it.
that, right? Yeah. You're just getting in there and like flipping things over and mixing it up.
Adding
Keeping
air
oxygen in
into
there.
the
Yeah,
center
adding
of
air,
it.
right.
Some people
Yeah.
call it compost fluffing, whatever you want to
Yeah,
call
that's
it.
a good term. I
And
like
you
that.
know,
Fluffing.
one way I've seen the 3 bays used, and I never thought about them being used like this, is they had, of course, the 3rd bay was the finished compost ready to be used. This
Mhm.
person had their system down, but they had one of the bays always empty. One of the other 2 were always empty. I was like, why is the one always empty? They said, we completely take the material out of bay 1, throw it into bay 2, and by that throwing, it completely
Oh, yeah.
aerates. And I was like,
Yeah.
dang, that's a
That's how
lot of
I've
work.
seen
But
it.
they produced amazing compost.
Yeah.
And ever since then, I thought, well, that's the golden. I mean, that's the standard, is that
Right.
you're flipping bay 1 and 2 back and forth, and in the process of moving from one side to the other, you aerate
Mhm.
100% completely. And then the 3rd was just finished. Nothing else goes in the 3rd. It's finished. It's done. It's stabilized. It's sitting there ready to be used. And when I was out on Oregon, I think, and something I hadn't thought about. All the compost, people that were serious about it had roofs on them that were on hinges that
Hmm.
they could fold back and forth. They said, "Well, it rains so much here, our
Yeah.
compost piles get just soaked." And that
Yeah.
these were 3 bins, and I think it was a demo we were looking at, and just made such perfect sense that in a rainy environment like that, they got a lot of daily rain. Is that there was a 3 bin and they were using it just as I described, but in addition to that, they had a roof on there that they could just flip back and forth,
Yeah.
which was way cool. I mean, they were
Mhm.
pretty serious about their compost. But yeah, that's the 3 bay system. You said you've seen it used like that also, Alexis, as far as
Yeah.
flipping
When
back and
we were
forth.
in Oregon.
Okay, Oregon also, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the style. I mean, that to me, moving it from point A to point B and then from point B back to point A makes a lot of sense as far as making it this mechanistic process that's not like, it's very clear when it's done. Like
Mhm.
when that process is done, whereas if you're just like fluffing it or something, I'm like, oh, I don't know.
Did you get
The
to
way
the
that
bottom, or do you
Yeah,
don't even know
yeah,
if you get
right.
complete fluffage? I mean, I don't know if that's a
the way
term or
that
not.
the way that I've done it, and I did this in part because I started composting when I was still a highly not settled graduate student, or undergrad student, I guess. And so I was moving my bins with me across time.
Nice.
And so I got the like really heavy duty garbage cans that are like the brute style
Mhm.
garbage cans.
Mm-hmm.
And I cut the bottom off, buy a $50 or $60 garbage can and immediately cut the bottom off. It's pretty awesome.
Solid.
Hurts. That
Nice.
hurts. Yeah.
Drill a bunch of holes in the sides to create like some airflow stuff, and I sit it upside down on the ground, almost like a cylinder, sort of like a Pringles can with no bottom.
Mhm.
Build up the stuff in there, layering over time. Take your vegetable scraps and your brown matter, and layer them. When it gets full, I take and I slide the whole Pringles can off of the thing, move it directly to the right, scoop and refill it from the top to the bottom, turning it as
Oh,
I
yeah.
go.
Nice.
Mhm.
And so it's basically like you can create a new bay by just lifting the can off and moving it.
Right.
And it has worked really well, and I still use it in our yard now. A bay system would be cool, but the advantage is it's highly portable, because you just basically have some empty garbage cans.
Right.
And I have two cans, I think, two of them like that. And I would say that the higher quality can was worth it because I did that like 15
Yeah.
more years ago. I don't know, between
And the
15 and 20
plastic
years
hasn't
ago.
disintegrated yet.
And it is
Yeah. The
still,
sun's not
they are
broken it down.
still rocking and rolling the same way that they were day one, which is pretty cool because they've been out in the sun quite a bit. And that works for me. It's not high volume, we fill those up pretty quick, but it is a way to manage it.
So that leads me to a question I don't think we've talked about. Where do you put your bin? Whatever kind of bin, whatever kind of system you decide to use, where is the ideal place to put it?
The front street curb so
Right
everybody can
beside the
see
neighbor's
Right,
what
as
you're
house.
doing.
close to your neighbor's house as you can get.
Yes.
Mhm.
No, no. I think
So,
someplace where you have to look at it, first of all. I mean, it's kind of the
mhm.
garden theory to me. If I have to look at it, I'll pay attention to it. And if I pay attention
Right.
to it, I'll
If
manage
you're
it.
gonna at least pass it, yeah, and so that you can
Yeah,
add
yeah, yeah.
your, it's somewhere accessible. That's one thing that I didn't do the first time I did this, was it wasn't in an accessible place, and so then I would collect it all in a bag, and it would stink by the time I got that bag to the actual compost bin. So
Mm-hmm.
putting it, out, a lot of people put it out right outside like a kitchen door or something like that, or at least like on the path that you walk if you're going to the barn or something like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Can be really helpful. But what I was thinking was, do you want sun or shade?
I do. I like sun. I like better
Mm-hmm.
than shade. I've done
Mm-hmm.
both. And if you're working the compost, then a little bit of shade. Somebody informed me once. They're like, in the summer when you're working this compost bin, a little shade's not bad. I
Yeah,
think
for
you can
you.
make either work
All right.
as long as the area, the pad that it sits on, is
Mm-hmm.
well drained. That's more
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
important than sun and shade to me.
Yeah.
Is the drainage of the general area. If you have a wet area, you're not going to have a good time with your
No,
compost sitting on
no.
there. It's always going to do bad things on the bottom of that pile.
And I would say if you put it in the sun, and I mean, you still have to actively manage it, no different than you would in the shade, but I think it'll speed the process up just a little bit, right? Because
It
that
gets
heat,
warmer.
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That heat is what helps break things down. It keeps the microbes active. You can get the temperatures up a little bit higher because you get the sun baking it. And that's why
Yeah.
a lot of
In the
compost,
wintertime, especially. Yeah,
yeah, a lot of the
absolutely.
compost bins you'll see, if you go buy one, are black. And that's,
Yes.
they hold heat
Mm-hmm.
And
a
that's
little bit
that's another
more.
question we get. Can you compost in the winter? And technically, it's a 3 by 3 pile. If it's active, it's going to maintain a core heat and continue to do a moderate job. But composting does in Kentucky, if it's just a standard homeowner compost pile, is going to slow way down in the winter. So
Hmm.
it does have a certain amount of seasonality to composting, or I mean, if it's not at least a 3 foot high by 3 foot wide, it's not going to self insulate and
Hmm.
just about almost completely go dormant. It's the microorganisms are going to be in there; they're just not working as active, and then that'll kick back off in the spring and summer months. Just be aware of that. Is
Hmm.
that composting does slow down the colder it gets? Yeah.
And if you're kind of the like more last system we can talk about, unless somebody has others, are these
Oh,
ones that you're going to buy, like
yeah.
these tumblers you can get at box stores. I have one. It's on a stand so that I can get a wheelbarrow underneath it. So that was part of that functionality to me, is that I can get a wheelbarrow underneath it to empty it, because where I have mine located, because of the way my brain works, is if, unless it's literally right outside my kitchen door, I will not put things in it. I
Totally.
tried I had like a little compost pail, and I was like, I'm going to take this and, dump it on my way walking up to the barn. Never did it. It got weird. There was a lot of flies involved. So the only way I have successfully composted is if I make dinner, I put it all in just like something, and I walk 10 feet away and I dump it in there.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, so I have one that's on a stand, and it doesn't have necessarily a handle to crank it, but it has these things where I can just easily turn it, because I don't want to go out there with a pitchfork. I'm not going to get as much volume out of it because it's not as big, but mine actually does have bays, which I think is cool. So there
Mm-hmm.
is a divider in there that does allow airflow, and it's vented. And so one side, I fill it. And then once it's, full, I leave that one alone and I start in the other bay, and with the theory of, once one bay is full, the other one should be close or ready to go. So there's always an ability to have something to put in there. And then I turn it just manually, kind of pulling the
How
barrel
often do
around.
you roll that tumbler? Like on the full one?
It depends on the time of year, but I actually try and rotate it at least once or twice a week when I'm
Mm-hmm.
taking stuff out, just because what I want to do is make sure that this new stuff I just put in got incorporated into that. And
Totally.
so it's just a little bit easier for those microbes to get on it rather than it just sitting right on top.
And for
So
you and
Mm-hmm.
that's,
Brett, those enclosed systems, did you have to add water? Because
no, I have enough food scraps, moisture,
and
high
what
Right.
should the
moisture.
compost feel like? I mean, we've not touched on that, and that's a basic thing we
Mm.
probably should.
The
If you guys are like,
recommendation
what
at
should the
like
compost feel like?
50% moisture or something like that, I
Which
think
feels
is
like I've heard it described as, I think you told me this, Alexis, like a wet sponge,
Like a
like a
runny
wrung out
Yeah.
wet
sponge.
sponge.
Yeah.
What's that, Brett?
Mine's not actually closed, so
Oh, that's
I
right.
actually
Yeah.
have to keep you mentioned the lid. So I saved the lid, which is bigger, much bigger, and overhangs the bottom because it's sort of like
Mm.
a, as a to keep water out most of
Mm.
the year.
Yeah.
Occasionally, when we're in
Mhm.
drought and we get a couple of rainfalls, I'll take it off. But a lot of times, I'm trying to
Okay.
keep
You're
it
managing the
open.
moisture kind of though then. Yeah,
Mhm.
you have a
Yeah, I
way.
very
Yeah.
rarely have to add
Gotcha.
water.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I
Nice.
think I think that depends on, where you live and where yours is located. So if you do get a fair amount of rain throughout the season, then you probably never need to add water to your compost unless, like Brett said, we're going through a drought and then you may want to hit it with a hose
Yeah.
or something like that. But very rarely, at least in Kentucky, do
Yeah.
people have to add water to their compost if they are putting in enough greens. So if you're not putting in enough greens and you need to kind of kickstart it again, you can add water to help with that process.
Yeah, and if you had the
Awesome.
wood chips and you were adding the nitrogen, you would
Yeah.
definitely want to add water.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing we cannot skip over before the end here is why are we doing all this? And I guess really what I'm asking is some of the uses or some of the benefits of compost.
Mm.
And that's a question I get. So, anybody
Well,
want to
but
tackle that? Yeah.
as a prelude to that, I think one of the things that I think one of the reasons why we thought we had covered compost before is because at a very like core theoretical level, we have
Hmm.
in our conversation about soil.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about carbon and nitrogen cycling in soil. We talked about how if you, for instance, if you cut down a cover crop and you lay it down on the soil, at times it will actually, quote unquote, bind up the nitrogen that's in the soil
Hmm.
and make it unavailable to plants. So all of these processes are kind of part of the same, they're playing on the exact same dynamics.
Hmm.
And the fact that you have to add nitrogen in some cases to the soil in order for a plant to have enough to grow, and in some cases, you need more carbon because the organic matter of the soil is too low and you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
build that through time. And so I think, as a prelude to the why or the what, how this fits, it fits into this much bigger picture, both, you know, with plant physiology, with soil health, with waste management, with
Mm-hmm.
fertility, all of those things. So that would
Hmm.
be my
Yeah.
like connection making to these other things as a prelude to maybe some of the other reasons why we do it or how it's
Like an
cool.
amazing modifier, in other words.
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah.
I like to use the term conditioner when I talk about
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
compost rather than like necessarily soil. I think there's a little bit of a misconception sometimes, like especially people who maybe want to use their compost for their house plants or their raised bed garden or on a smaller scale like that, where they're probably making enough where they could fill their whole pot up for their house plant or most of their raised bed with compost, and that's not really what you need to necessarily be doing. I like to think of it as a conditioner. It's basically like a shot to the heart of adrenaline for your soil of good microbes, lots of nutrients, things that will improve what is already there. And so that's why
Mm-hmm.
when we tell people, adding compost into a garden, you're really only looking about an inch over the
Yeah.
surface is all you really need because it's a conditioner. You're not trying to change immediately change the physical appearance of your soil. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
And
Mm-hmm.
I find it's amazing for like, folks install these raised beds that are usually peat based mixes
Mm-hmm.
and those don't last forever.
Mm-mm.
And I find that that's an amazing use for compost is just top dressing that
Mm-hmm.
continuously. And if you read all the literature, that's one of the recommended practices, common recommended
Mm-hmm.
practices, because it does so many things. Like Brett said, it enhances the ability of the soil to hold nutrients. The organic matter just will hold water in addition to nutrients better. So
Mm-hmm.
it'll do all those things. And every now and again, I'll run into folks and they're like, "Well, we do it for the fertilizer value." And I usually don't think of compost in terms
Mm-hmm.
of just like its mass ability to have nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all the
It's like
macronutrients. It's
1%. Like it's
it's
you typically
1%.
very
Yeah,
low depending
it's
on what you put in
low, but
it.
as Brett said, it's all of those, and you, Alexis, it's all those secondary, and they're not really secondary to me. There's all those other things that compost does, and its ability to condition and modify the soil profile with just a little bit, continuously added throughout the years, just makes such a huge difference.
I feel like it's like taking a vitamin.
Yeah.
It's
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
like the compost is like you taking a vitamin. You still have to have a healthy diet. You still have to drink plenty of water and do all those good things. But the vitamin is just gives you that little boost to improve how those other things work.
Just soil structure, just alone, just if you take a heavy soil and just in you, over the years, I've seen compost make such a huge difference over many, many years.
Yeah.
But just
I think
like
that's,
structure.
That's the key thing you're saying there, Ray, is over many years. That
yes,
a lot, almost all like in life, almost all things, all important lasting changes are subtle. They take time. They take little bits of commitment.
Why don't you just stab me in the heart?
The results are very slow. Yeah, no, they're not flashy.
Ray's over here with this like cubic yards of 30-day-old compost.
I was hoping to end this on a high note, and you're saying I'm the problem. It's me with my expectations, man. But yeah, time.
And I think I would add something Alexis is talking about here, and this is an interesting phenomenon that I've been able to observe like within my lifetime. I think. You mentioned it's like a vitamin, and I would add it's like a vitamin plus a probiotic.
Yeah,
in the sense that like our understanding of the microbe communities has expanded so drastically. Like the era of the microbiome, which I don't know, started probably 20 years ago, where we're understanding, moving away from just pure germ theory and antimicrobial, antibacterial, etc. That's another piece of the puzzle that you can only really adjust gradually over time with this dedicated management of other aspects of the soil ecosystem and reduce things like reduced tillage or things like cover cropping or whatever, keeping the soil covered, not letting it lay fallow and bake in the sun and crack and all the other fun stuff. And it's just such you're playing this very interesting caretaker role in the sense that you are growing and supporting and developing these microbial communities in the compost, but you're also doing that in your soil. It's just like you're playing this very interesting stewardship role, and it's something that I think people have been doing for a really long time. But I find that aspect of it to be pretty cool. And in addition to I think the most slam dunk reason for most people, if I were pitching for them why they should compost, it would be on that waste management side of just let's just keep a little bit of we're filling up landfills like crazy, and some of it doesn't. Some of it could go back out and become part of the soil structure and the root structure and the flowers that you're growing or the whatever else. You could put it back into the cycle. So I think that's those are the main reasons I think I do it, or I think that one might consider doing it. I like the spinner things, especially like the tumbler things.
Yeah,
we don't have one, but I think that people just get this sense of like they have to do everything all the way or nothing at all. And because for us, we would fill a tumbler if we put all of it in. We would fill a tumbler pretty quick. But honestly, we'd probably turn over compost a lot quicker, and maybe it wouldn't actually end up being an issue at all in the long term. But if someone wants to do that, I was just so jealous. You were saying like, oh, you just turn. I mean, for you, turning it is just like whoop, and we're done.
Yeah.
That's so cool. And yeah.
Well, I knew I wouldn't do it otherwise,
Exactly.
like I know.
Exactly.
And so that's what it comes down to is like, what are you actually going to use? And like, I've used enough different ones. I used one where it was a tumbler, but it was sat on the ground and made sense. I thought, oh, this will last a longer time. But then when I was trying to get it, that thing's heavy when it's full. So then when you're trying to get it into a wheelbarrow or somewhere, it was difficult because you're still pulling it out of like one.
Is a huge shout. I love that.
Yeah. So that was my. I got a career ladder bump, so I was impressive enough, and I got a bump, and I was like, I'm gonna buy myself a rain barrel and a compost bin.
Party time!
Great Alexis treat yourself day.
Horticulture goals. Horticultural goals.
Various horticulturally affiliated barrels.
Yes.
I didn't even realize I just bought 2 barrels to do 2 different things.
Some people would go to Maui. No, not this girl.
No, I was like, vacation. What vacation? I'm going to compost this summer.
I'm going to compost the heck out of this.
That is a vacation.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Good stuff.
Awesome. Well, if you like that, if you want to know more about composting, I think one thing that I am pushing for, and hopefully everyone agrees, but we're gonna do it. Period. Is talking about vermicomposting maybe in the future, and I love that because again, whether you're going to be commercial or even if you live in an apartment, vermicomposting can be something that you can do to and it's fun because you got pet worms and I think that's fun. But,
They have
I'm a big
names.
I am a big fan. I've had my worm bin for 11 years now, and they are my children. I have millions of them. But anyways,
Yeah.
we'll talk.
Fun little teaser for that
Yeah,
episode that
a little
I'll share
teaser
the full
there.
story then. The,
Sorry, I'm
uh, Worm Bin did play a key role in my courtship of my wife Annie. So
The
okay.
plot
All right. I
thickens.
can't wait. We're gonna have that. So if you want that sooner rather than later, leave us a little review and tell us we want to know about the worm courtship. We would like,
Worm
and while you're
courtship.
there,
Okay.
give us 5 reviews that are 5-star reviews so that we can do this worm courtship story. I'm here for that. You can also shoot us an email if you've got questions about compost, maybe which one you're gonna buy or what you're thinking about, maybe what you can add or any problems that you're having. Feel free to shoot us an email. We've got that email in the show notes. And one of us and all of us will see it, and at least one of us will help you. Most likely, all of us will go in together on that. So happy to do that for you guys. And then you can also follow us on Instagram at Hort Culture Podcast, and you can send us a message there if you think of something. It's a good way to find information we share from other organizations around Kentucky and other info as well. So it's not just, hey, we have an episode out this week, but some of the other things that are happening that you plant peeps may be interested in. So please check us out on there. And we hope that as we grow this podcast, you will grow with us and that you'll join us next time. Next time? Next time. Anyways,